Hello, and welcome to an episode of Beyond the Baton, where today we'll be talking about one of the eras of classical music known as the Classical Era. We'll do a little bit of review about what we talked about last time we did some music history, and we'll move on to the new thing. So, just quick recap. Last time it was Baroque music. That was from 1600 to about 1750. And now it's time to move on. This time we're going to be going all the way from 1750 to 1820, so not even a 100-year stretch, and it's important. Everything we know of as instrumental music with orchestras, we call that classical music, but really it's named after this one time period called the Classical Era. So important that we named the entire genre of classical music after the era itself. So how did we get here? Well, way back in the medieval era, from about 1000 to 1400, we have music, and that's Gregorian chant, literally chant or song sung by Gregorian monks throughout Europe. Now, this doesn't mean that music was invented in 1000. What this really means is that it's these folks, these monks, were the first people to start to notate the music or write it down, because music has been around since probably forever. Cavemen picking up rocks, banging them together, people blowing through reeds, creating sounds. The problem is, we don't know what any of that music sounds like. I think the oldest thing we have is from ancient Greece, and it's just one solitary melody. And even that, we're not exactly sure if we're playing that properly. So, the first era of classical music is the medieval era from the monks. Thank you, monks. Next comes the Renaissance era. And there we start to break out of the church realm, where we have instruments in church and, of course, instruments outside of church. And the primary source of entertainment during this time is dances. That's our social gathering place. That's how we meet people. That's how we ask people out on dates. And music has to be there. Otherwise, there's no dancing without the music. So the Renaissance era is a big, important part of the instrumental developmental process. And that's from about 1400 to 1600. What we talked about last time was the Baroque era from 1600 to 1750, and now we're breaking out of the dance era, or dance areas, I should say, and into the concert halls. So we have new combinations of instruments that have been developed throughout the Renaissance, and we're putting those instruments together to create concert music. And that's the Baroque, and that's what we talked about last time. There are a few types of things that we need to remember. The first is just the concept of an orchestra. An orchestra is just a group of instrumentalists. Any group of instrumentalists. Could be a percussion orchestra. It could be a brass orchestra, a woodwind orchestra, a string orchestra, any combination of anything. A kazoo orchestra, ukulele orchestra. Any group of instruments is an orchestra. Then we go one step beyond that, and that's having a soloist, an individual soloist with the orchestra. It could be a violin solo, a cello solo, could be a trumpet concerto, it could be a piano concerto, it could be a harpsichord concerto, it could be a kazoo concerto, it could be a harp, anything, any sort of concerto, a soloist with an orchestra. If you take a soloist and multiply them, you get a concerto grosso, literally meaning a large concerto. And by this, we just mean there's more than one soloist. Usually it's 3 or 4, probably one from each primary group of instruments that's in that particular orchestra at the time. And that group of soloists is called the concertino, or the people playing the concerto. And then we have the orchestra part, which is just called the ripiino. And they form the basis of what we know. They are instruments. Next, what are they playing? A couple different forms or way to structure music. We have binary form, which is 2 parts. There's an A melody, repeated, and there's a B melody, repeated, and that's binary form. Pretty simple, very straightforward. Then we have ternary form, which is 3 parts. You have your A melody repeated, B melody repeated, and A melody again. And again, usually repeated. Sometimes you'll see that little prime symbol on the third part, just reminding you, hey, this is the second time that it's come around. And yes, this stuff is actually repeated, because if we didn't repeat it, it's very short. And remember, this is coming out of the dance halls. So if we have short music, we can't dance with our sweethearts very long. And that's the point of going to the dance. So we repeat these things just to give us more time with the people that we're there to be with. So moving on from this develops the Baroque era. The Baroque era is typically known for having a lot of notes. And again, this is coming out of sort of having something new to do with music. All of the monks can only sing so long because your voice gets tired and you physically need breaks in order to play. If you're a violinist who's practiced a bit, you conceivably could just play literally all night until your fingers fall off. So you see a lot of 16th notes, not many rests, and that's typical in the Baroque time period because we're so excited to finally be able to use instruments and have this continual sound all of the time that composers took that opportunity. One of the instruments that allow them to do this is the harpsichord. Again, the harpsichord doesn't get tired. The player might get tired, but the instrument itself could conceivably play all night. And this instrument, the harpsichord, is what is very popular in the Baroque time period. It shows up in the orchestras, but it doesn't last very long because the instrument is played by touching a key which plucks a string, which doesn't allow for any sort of dynamic. So the more instruments you add to the orchestra, the less you can hear the harpsichord, and eventually it sort of just phases out because of the limitations of the volume of the instrument. And probably the big thing about the Baroque era is ornamentation. And if we think of ornaments like on a Christmas tree, it's something that's decorated, and that's what happens to this music. The music gets very decorated. There's lots of trills, the ornaments, there's a lot of extra notes thrown in around the melody, and then the people actually playing the melody would add their own on top of what the composer already had. And this is why it gets its name. Baroque really just means irregular, but the way that they used it back then was to describe pearls. So the composers that came after the Baroque era said, "Oh, that was so Baroque. Like, oh, what an ugly pearl of music that is. Ugh, so Baroque." And that negative nickname stuck. And now all of art and architecture and music is known as Baroque because of all the frilly extra bits. There you go. Be careful how you use your words, ladies and gentlemen. So these trills, they happen usually at the end of phrases, but sometimes in the middle of the phrases, sometimes at the beginning of the phrases. And in this piece of music, here's the first 9 measures, and here are the 21 different ornaments and trills in the first 9 measures. This is a harpsichord piece by François Couperin, and as you see, lots and lots of ornamentation. This is eventually what people want to get away from. Very, very Baroque. But I guess it should, it's worthy to mention. I mean, to be fair, this piece of music, he is trying to mimic the sound of birds, but still, pretty much all Baroque music is going to have lots and lots of trills. So be on the lookout if you see something with lots of trills, or hear a harpsichord, or heaven forbid, a harpsichord with a lot of trills. It's Baroque. So what happens? The Baroque era ends at 1750. Now, it's not a cut and dry, oh, Bach died at 1750, so we're done with that time period. That's not how it works, right? J.S. Bach does die in 1750. He's sort of the big, important composer of this time period. He passes away, and it's just a good benchmark to say, that's about when the time period ended. Time to move on and do something else. So people are still writing in this style. It's going to sound Baroque-ish, but composers start to experiment by writing music that's less ornamented, less complex. But, some elements of that still sneak in. There still are trills in our music. We still have sometimes more than one melody happening at once, but the frequency is much, much less. And this, of course, makes it lighter music, which is a bit strange because as things go through time, usually things get more complex. But at this juncture of classical music, it actually gets more simple. And this new simple style is called the Gallant Style, or Stile Galant. And it really just means light, a little bit more simple. And the people that are starting to compose in this time period are names that we might recognize. We might recognize Luigi Boccherini. We might recognize Christoph Willibald Gluck, wrote lots of operas. Then we have Johann Christian Bach, different than Johann Sebastian. Johann Sebastian Bach's his father. Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, also one of J.S. Bach's kids, and Wilhelm Friedman Bach, one of Bach's kids. There's a lot of them, and a lot of them did music. Go figure. But all these composers start to write music that makes a little bit more sense because it's a little bit more simple, it's a little bit more direct, and it's a little bit more straightforward. How does this new style develop? Well, the big complaint from the Baroque era was all the complexity, all the trills, all the melodies happening at the same time. So we're trying to get away from that. And if you can sort of imagine the first violin's playing something that sounds like the melody, and the second violin's playing something that sounds like the melody, and the cello's playing something that sounds like a melody, your brain sort of gets overwhelmed with all of the different melodies. It gets really, really stressful. And we wanted to try and avoid that. So the Gallant style tries to take away that extra stuff. The emphasis becomes making one melody be the shining star. So there's a melody that has a simple accompaniment that is just there for support. Instead of everybody trying to be melody all the time, we have one melody and everybody else sort of supporting that thing. So this makes melodies shorter, makes them less chromatic. So there's less accidentals in the notes, it's less complicated. And it sort of becomes standardized into either a 4-measure melody or an 8-measure melody. Basically something that is symmetrical. You can go 2 measures and you're halfway there, and then 4 measures, you've ended the melody. Or, a little bit longer. You have an 8-measure melody, 4 measures into it, you're about halfway there, and then the last 4 measures sort of takes you back home to where you began. And by standardizing these melodies, it actually helps to standardize the harmony. So in the Baroque time period, we started to make the differentiation between major and minor. Now we're starting to figure out how to use major and minor in such a way that the audience knows something big is about to happen. So the big chords that we know are the 1 chord and the 5 chord, and going from 5 to 1 makes it sound like it's something going home. So music theory starts to have a bit more relevance to this kind of music. So with this melody becoming a little bit more simple, it's allowing the audience, it's allowing the public to understand it a little bit more. They can hear just one melody and now it's recognizable. If it's catchy, it's even better because then you can remember it and sing it instead of trying to remember that one melody in amongst so many others. And being able to hear this single melody puts a big importance on that one melody. So, of course, composers will continually develop this concept. I mean, it's not going to just continually back up until the melodies are just one single note being played, right? It is going to get a little bit more complex. But the emphasis on focusing on the melody is something that's going to be a driving force in the classical era, and it's going to last literally for hundreds of years. Basically, melody is the key component of music until rap becomes the mainstream popular genre in the early 2000s. And rap is more rhythm based as opposed to melodically based. So melody had its heyday. Now we're sort of letting rhythm have its turn. But even still, some of the best rappers are using good melodies in their raps. And of course, good melodies and the bass line and their beats, good bass lines. If you remember those little saxophone licks here and there and guitar riffs. So melody's still a crucial part, but it's not front and center anymore. Also in the classical time period, we have a new form. We have sonata form. And this comes from the treatment of the melody, or in other words, how composers are using the melody. What they're doing is they're developing upon the ternary form to create extra drama within the music. I mean, because let's face it, A, B, A is kind of lame, especially if it's exactly the same and you're just repeating it, kind of boring. So there's still going to be an A theme and there's still going to be a B theme. However, instead of having A theme repeated and then B theme repeated, they're going to repeat the whole thing as a unit. So you'll get A, B, and then repeated A, B. So it's sort of a bigger chunk, a bigger bite to chew upon mentally. And then they're going to take those two ideas, the A part and the B part, and they're going to develop them. Maybe they will change the key. Maybe they will combine the two melodies. Maybe they will shorten the first melody and lengthen the second melody, or vice versa. Lengthen the first melody, shorten the second melody. Maybe they'll just skip a melody altogether and just sort of riff on it and improvise. Who knows? They're going to develop it. They're going to make it more interesting. But then they are going to bring it back one more time at the end because, again, this is an art form. This is a business for them. This is how they're making their money. If you don't remember how the melody goes, you're not going to remember them as a composer. If you don't remember them as a composer, you're not going to ask them to hire for the next thing that you have to have music for, so they're going to lose out on money. So having that melody come back is a pretty important thing for our composer friends. What does this sonata form really look like? There's the A theme and the B theme. But as I said, it's repeated. So the whole unit itself is repeated. And then those ideas are developed. And then they come back. This is pretty straightforward, actually, if you write it all out. And you could say, well, how come it's not quintary form instead of ternary form? There's 5 parts, so quintary. It seems to be a bit of a mouthful. And also, we can actually sort of organize this a little bit more succinctly. Each one of these sections has a name. So when the melodies are exposed or introduced, those first 2 bits, the A theme and the B theme, are called the exposition. So if you ever been to an expo or heard of an expo, short for exposition, it's when you are exposed to something. So here the composer is exposing the audience to the melodies in the exposition. And then when the melodies are developed, that's called the development. Very original, I know. And then when the melodies come back, it's sort of like they're being recapped or reviewed. And in fact, that's exactly what it's called. It's called the recapitulation. So if you've ever heard of a recap, it's short for recapitulation. And there you go. It's just the original stuff coming back. Now you'll notice that there's a color scheme, and you might remember that I mentioned something about harmony. So here's how harmony starts to have a role in form and indeed in all of music together. We know that music has a key signature. So the A theme starts in the key of the key signature. That makes sense. The B theme is going to be in a key signature that's a fifth away. The development, we're not totally sure what the composer is going to do because they're developing it and they want to create drama. And then for the recap, the melodies come back in the original key that it started in. Now this looks pretty simple, right? 1, 5, question marks, and then back to the 1. So if we think about it in terms of the way music works, if you think of a scale, let's say we're in C major, the first note of a C scale is C. So if you build a chord on that, that's the 1 chord because it's built on the first note of the scale. If you were to go to the 5th note of a C scale, so C, D, E, F, G, there's your 5th note of the scale. If you build a chord on that, that's your 5 chord because you built the chord on the 5th note of the scale. And that's a very strong relationship in music. 1 to 5, 5 going to 1 makes it sound like it's coming to an end. And the notes that are actually in the chord will lead us back to that 1 note or back to that C. So 1 to 5, 5 to 1 is very, very strong and very powerful in music. And it takes root here because in the classical time period, we're starting to standardize these things, and this is how we do it. And very, very important. So all the music theory stuff, again, this is where it comes into play. And this is where, if you're a composer, it's important to know this. And as an audience member, if you can hear these relationships, you can sort of be ahead of the game. You'll know when a piece of music is going to the development. You'll know when the piece of music is going back to the recap. And you'll know when the piece of music is coming to an end. And that's all because of the way the music works together. And that's the harmony of sonata form. It eventually changes, and that's some of the things that gets a little bit more complex. The chords are different, but basically, this is your standard sonata form. So who's writing this? Who are the big players in the classical time period? Well, arguably, the most important person is Franz Joseph Haydn. He was a composer for the courts, which is not like a court of law, but like a royal court. And this family is not royal, but very rich. The Esterhazy family lived out in away from the city. They sort of lived out in like the pastoral countryside, and they had a lot of money. So they hired a composer for their family, and they built him a house and a concert hall and hired an entire orchestra just for Haydn. Again, remember, no electricity, so no TV, no TikTok, no nothing. So the highest form of entertainment were these orchestras. So they hired their own movie studio, essentially, to create movies for them, except not movies, orchestras. So Haydn is sort of the key player here, pardon the pun. He works for the Esterhazys. Like Bach, he has this constant source of income because he has a constant audience, because he's always composing things. Bach worked in the church, so he had people coming to his services every Sunday. Haydn worked where they expected a concert every week. So with that idea, being able to compose something every week, he lived away from the city, and he was able to develop new ideas all on his own. So basically, he single-handedly sets the stage. He sets up these styles because in the city, everyone's sort of doing what has already been done and they're trying to make money. Haydn has a reliable source of income, so he has the opportunity to build on things and experiment. He lays the foundations for all of the classical era and basically everything that comes after it. Good job, Franz. He starts writing in the Gallant style, focusing on simple melodies with harmonic support. Eventually, this changes, and what he starts to do is that he combines different ideas. Back in the Baroque time period, it was frowned upon to combine two different ideas. To have something happy and sad show up in the same piece of music was horrible. It was just no good. It was anathema. But not for Haydn. Haydn had the flexibility to do things, and so he would do it. He would have two contrasting emotions. It would be major and minor in the same piece of music. It would be a fast rhythm and a slow rhythm in the melody. You might have high pitches and also low pitches. So he was able to experiment and explore different sounds within one piece of music and sort of encompass more of the world within one thing. He also began taking shorter forms, like dance forms, that binary and that ternary form, and making them longer and making them a little bit more developed, a little bit more concert friendly. If we think of a whole bunch of dances and we would play them all together, like back to back to back to back to back, maybe five different dances, a fast dance, a slow dance, a fast dance, a slow dance, a faster dance, and we played them back to back to back to back to back, and then took a break, that would be called a suite, Suite. And Haydn would do this and then realize, wait a minute, we're not really dancing here. This is the concert hall. So why don't I compose something but aren't dances? It's more concert music and put them all together. And he starts to take these suites and change them into something else. And this is where we start to get symphonies. He also writes sort of smaller scale pieces of music called string quartets. And both of these things, symphonies and string quartets, are the next big thing to happen in the classical era and for all of classical music. Haydn writes 104 symphonies and 68 string quartets. That's a lot. Mozart is the next biggest player in this game. He writes 41 symphonies and 23 string quartets. Beethoven writes 9 symphonies. Dvorak writes 9 symphonies. Sibelius writes 7 symphonies. So 104 is a lot. And because of this, Papa Haydn, or Franz Haydn, earns two nicknames, the father of the symphony and the father of the string quartet. For both of these, the symphonies and the string quartets, he writes them with four movements. So if we imagine a book has multiple chapters. A symphony or a string quartet has multiple movements. So these little things make up the larger work. And again, Haydn's taking his ideas from dance suites. So these movements typically go a fast movement, a slow movement, and then a dance movement, maybe like an old minuet and trio he'll just throw in for fun, and then he'll end with a fast thing. And this works pretty well, pacing wise. If you think of books, you start exciting and then there's like a little bit of character development and then exciting plot and then exciting finale. That's how this music works. Fast to get the audience into it, slow, lyrical, something pretty to give the ears a break, and then something playful and dance like before the big fast rock ending. Haydn sets this up. Not completely and totally original. This is sort of like a human concept to do it this way. But Haydn's the one who does it repeatedly that everybody else now starts to copy. So again, thank you, Franz. He would then combine all of these things, all of these movements. He would connect them through that use of harmony. So we already talked about 1 and 5. He wouldn't just stick to that. So maybe that first movement would start in the key. Let's say it's C major again. So the first movement will be in C major. The slow movement won't be C major because that's boring, but maybe we'll build this movement on the fourth note of the scale. So in C major, C, D, E, F. So maybe the second movement would be in F major. So related, it's close by, but not exactly C. And then let's say, we have a sprightly dance, or like, I don't know, we have butterflies flitting about, and we'll keep the same key signature. So we'll do C major key signature, but we'll do it in minor. So we'll do A minor, and then the last movement again will be C major. So again, not all C major, but they're all related. They're all close by. And having that relationship is something else that Haydn does that everybody else starts to copy. So very important. Using these different instruments and using these concepts, again, it just builds on the use of melody as the main player in the game, so to speak. If we look at string quartets, it's very simple to see. The first violin is the highest pitched instrument, and that's what gets the melody. So it's not like Haydn and Mozart and all those guys liked violin one more than cello. It's just the highest pitched thing is easier to hear. So you give the melody to that person, and then everybody else just helps out. So the concept of first violins always have the melody sort of comes from the classical time period. So cellists, you can shake your fists there. Um, and that's it. So again, not something that Haydn like trademarks, but he does it. Everybody else copies it. Again, there you go, Haydn. But the big thing that he does for the world of orchestra is develop symphonies. These are incredibly important because he starts to build drama within them because of the instruments that he uses. So again, an orchestra is just any assortment of instruments. Haydn starts combining instruments in sort of an intelligent and organized way. He uses different families all together. So the string family, violin, viola, cello, bass, very, very common. In fact, symphonies wouldn't be symphonies without them, right? We have wind symphonies, not symphonies. If you just say symphony, it implies strings. Wind symphony would just be a concert band. So strings are the critical player of a symphony. But there are other quote unquote band instruments. We have the woodwind family, and Haydn uses these members: the flute, the oboe, the clarinet, and the bassoon. These are called woodwinds because the instruments were originally made out of wood and they made sound by blowing wind through them. So, again, not a very original name, woodwinds. And indeed, they are still made out of wood. Flutes can be made out of silver and gold and aluminum and different things, but you can still find wooden flutes. Oboe, clarinet, bassoon, still made out of wood. Oboe, clarinet, bassoon also use reeds. And in fact, nowadays, that's actually what makes it a woodwind instrument is that you put reeds on the mouthpiece and these wooden reeds vibrate when you blow on them, and that's what creates the sound. So saxophones technically also are woodwinds because they use a reed, but they don't really show up into orchestras until the 1900s, and then people argue whether or not they should be in the orchestra, but that's a whole different topic. We'll get to that eventually. But woodwinds, definitely in an orchestra. Also, members of the brass family, trumpets and horns. Typically, people will call them French horns, but they're not French, so horn will suffice. There are other members of the brass family, trombones and tubas, but not in the classical time period. Some of these instruments actually, like the tuba, doesn't even exist yet, so can't be in the orchestra, just trumpets and horns. And percussion. Percussion at this time is basically just going to be the timpani drum or the kettle drum. They are tuned, so you can have pitches on your timpani drum, but they're basically the only thing that's being used. Occasionally, rarely, a triangle is used or a cymbal or a bass drum. But in this time period, basically, it's just timpani. So these four families unite to create the symphony orchestra. And Haydn is the person, again, he uses these combinations. He uses them so much, it's sort of his stylistic sound that everybody copies. He kind of standardizes the symphony orchestra. Again, a pretty big deal. Thanks, Franz. And within these symphonies, he's combining everything. He's combining elements of dance music, the concert music from the Baroque, the opera, and he's just finding all the most impactful moments of all these different styles, and he's putting them together in his symphonies and in his string quartets. And that is the basis now of instrumental writing for classical music in the classical time period. Haydn himself is pretty special because he has a sense of humor. And again, this is a different sense of humor than we have now because we have cat videos to watch and we have various things to combine on TikTok and we have, electricity. But back then, didn't happen. So how do you surprise your audience? Well, one way, as you see there, Symphony number 104 is billed as a D major symphony. It starts minor, scares the audience, a little bit of a shock to them. I know it sounds lame, but it was a big deal back then. It says D major. Why are you playing in minor? Weird. Also, his Symphony number 94, his surprise symphony, like I mentioned, he did work on an estate and it was a family affair, and so family and friends would come every week to hear his concerts. And Haydn would notice the same people falling asleep, and this annoyed him. So during his Symphony number 94, when he gets to the second movement, the slow one, it starts piano, and after his first 8-measure phrase, it gets softer, and the whole thing is soft. And then at the end of that second 8-measure Boom! It's loud, fortissimo, literally to wake up his audience because he got tired of them falling asleep. And here you can see one of those rare uses of a bass drum. This is the entire symphony music for the bass drum. You see the first movement, Adagio, goes Adagio, Vivace, 2 parts in the same movement. Tacit means rest. Andante is the second movement. You see that one singular note, fortissimo, rest, 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 rest. The third movement, Minuetto, is the dance. Tacit is rest. Fourth movement is a fast allegro, also rest. So they carted the bass drum to the concert hall for one note. Thanks, Franz. And the last thing that sort of demonstrates Haydn's humor, which again makes him popular amongst the audiences of Europe, is his Symphony No. 45. He worked for this Esterhazy family. They hired him, they hired the orchestra, but they did not hire him to take breaks, and they didn't give them breaks. They played every single week. And Haydn tried to talk them into giving them breaks. The family said no. So Haydn did the next best thing. He made a political statement in his symphony. In his final movement, instead of having a fast movement, he had it be slow. So that was a shock to the system. And then he actually had people leave the stage. And this was, again, a pretty big deal back then because there's no lights. So the way the musicians saw the music was they actually had candles on their stands. That was their stand light. So during the slow movement, the fourth movement, the audience is a little perplexed. And then as they're watching this happen, the movement go on and unfold, members of the orchestra are standing up, blowing out their candle and walking off stage until there were only 2 violinists left playing a little duet, who then blew out their candles and left the stage. And the point was made. And the orchestra did get a break. Again, thank you, Haydn. Moral of the story, Haydn's worthy of some praise and some thanks. But he's not the only guy. He's not the only player in town in all of Europe. Of course, there are plenty of other composers. And my guess is he is not the most famous. Even though he is the biggest innovator, he's probably the most important person for the development of music in the classical time period. He's not the most famous because there was this young musician that toured all of Europe and he became really famous, partially because he was so young and partially because he was so good. Because when you're 5 and you're playing for kings and queens, that tends to make a statement. This composer was touring, playing piano and violin at the age of 5. He was composing his own music by 6, composing entire symphonies by the time he was 8, and entire full operas by the time he was 14. He had a fantastic ear and a fantastic memory. He could hear a piece of music once or twice and be able to write it down verbatim, like you were able to write down a speech, but he would write the entire music, all of the parts on the right instruments, the right notes, and write it down. True story. He went to the Vatican. He was invited by the Pope to come to Rome when he was in Italy, and he heard a piece of music that the Vatican did not share. The only musicians in the entire world that knew this piece of music were the musicians in the Vatican. This young kid shows up, hears it, goes home and writes it down. He then goes to have lunch with the Pope the next day and gives the Pope the music. And the Pope is furious. He wants to know who stole this music out of the Vatican and gave it to this kid. And the kid goes, no. No one gave this to me. I was here yesterday. I heard it. Here you go. And he gives it back to them after one hearing. So this kid is pretty special. And that kid is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. First of a long line of child prodigies that have come through the world. There's Mendelssohn, there's Michael Jackson, but Mozart is our first big important person. Now, he didn't do anything super innovative. He didn't reorganize the way music's put together. He didn't invent Sonata Form. He basically just took everything that was there and he did it really, really well at an incredibly high level. He would be able to just write down melodies. You would be able to sit down and write it down on a piece of music, just like you would be able to sit down and write down a speech. You would just write it out with music. It was an incredibly high level. His music was melody and accompaniment, but his melodies were so special. They were very singable. They were very catchy. There was a little bit of chromatic stuff, a little bit of accidentals, but not too much. So it was just enough to keep it interesting, but not so much to be Baroque. And then the accompaniment was interesting enough that it wasn't boring. It was exciting. It created drama. and it would interplay, it would sort of be playful with the main melody. Not so much that it itself was a whole different melody, but it was enough to keep it very interesting, and the music complemented itself very much, and it's stuff that other people didn't do. He wrote symphonies, he wrote string quartets, but with mood changes and like plot twists, but with chords. So the harmonies would change. Mozart would do different harmonies that people wouldn't expect. Kept the audience interested and kept them engaged. He wrote operas, but he didn't pick any old opera. He would specially handpick the librettos or the lyrics and the plots. And then he would write music in a slightly different way than everybody else. So he would approach a plot with a different mood or a different attitude than other composers would, that created a different emotional response from the audience. Truly a special, fantastic person, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He was untouchable in popularity. All of Europe knew him because he was that young kid at the age of 5, and he grew up to be just equally fantastic. He surpassed everybody's hopes and dreams for him, and he was it. He was the bee's knees of all of Europe. He was friends with Haydn. They considered each other equals in composition. They were friends, they would complement each other, and there you go. Mozart studied with Johann Christian Bach, so one of Bach's kids, but Johann Christian Bach quickly was like, nah, you're beyond this. Go ahead and do your own. So he graduated out of that apprenticeship pretty quickly and became his own composer. But he was sort of always a kid at heart. He would steal people's ideas and improve upon them. He would make fun of them at parties because, again, he would hear something once and then be able to play it later and then improve upon it on the spot. So a very, very wonderful pianist, a wonderful violinist. He would be able to improv, both good and bad, if he didn't like you, I guess. He was a teacher. He did not have many students. One of the students that he did accept into his studio was a young guy named Ludwig van Beethoven. But unfortunately, Beethoven had a death in his family and didn't have a chance to actually study with Mozart. So one can only sort of guess and imagine what the music world would be like had Beethoven had a chance to study with Mozart. Alas. But anyway, just one last thing about Mozart. He was only really jealous of one person, and that was a Frenchman, an Afro-Frenchman. He came from Haiti, and his family came from Haiti and from France, and his name was Joseph Boulogne Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges. Pardon my horrible French. And this guy was his only competition. And, well, I guess I should save that because that's quite another story. But if you have time, look up Saint-Georges. Fantastic composer, fantastic life. Le Chevalier means that he was in the French army. He was a fencer. He won duels. He was just a spectacular person. He taught Marie Antoinette piano. Whole different story, but a great composer of the classical time period. So, the importance of the classical time period. The classical era, so important that they named the entire genre of classical music after it. So, why and how? Well, first of all, we have the standardization of the 4 or the 8 measure melody. Super important to be able to organize the melodies in this way, because with that, we learn how the melody and the harmony work together. In other words, how the chord progression works, how the harmony works. Very important, sets the standard. We also have the way that the melodies interact with each other. In other words, the form, right? So we have new sonata form. We also have a few other things. We have rondo form, but we'll get to that later on in life. But sonata form is the big key takeaway here. It also eventually affects things like rock and roll with choruses and verses and bridges and choruses and verses once again, but coming from the classical time period. We also have the type of music that is written. We have symphonies, we have string quartets, we have opera. And it is these 3 that sort of become the cornerstone of all of classical music. Basically, there are symphonic pieces, there are chamber pieces, or there's opera. And then there's variations on this, right? Instead of having a symphony, we could have a concert overture, which is just one movement. Instead of a string quartet, we could have a flute quartet or a woodwind quartet. Instead of opera, we have musicals. So basically, it's just these 3 things that are built upon for everything else from about 1770 even until today. And even you could say rock and roll groups are string quartets, basically, right? We have a bass, 2 guitars, and a drum set. There is your small chamber music. And all of this stuff that's built in the classical music, all the symphonies, the concerts, that's it. that is the biggest form of entertainment. In the Renaissance, it was sort of dances, and that's how we would get together with other people. But in the classical time period, it was music. It was concerts. That's what we did. We didn't wait for the new show to be released on a streaming device. We didn't wait until like in the 1990s when Friends and Seinfeld would be on TV the same night. And you wait until Thursday for that to happen. You would wait for Friday or Saturday night when the concerts would happen. So the audiences would be flocking to these concert halls, and these composers were the rock stars of their day. And classical music is the greatest source of entertainment all throughout Europe, thanks to all of these composers, all of these musical innovations, and the way that the audience can now access and hear the music and understand what's going on. Very, very important. It sets the stage of all the music that's composed after it, even until today. Even though that kid Beethoven, he does change some things, but the bare bones, the basic outline of everything that we know about classical music comes from the classical era, which is why it's so important. So who do you listen to? You want to go listen to some great classical music? Well, start with Mozart. 626 compositions. He only lived to be 30-something, 37-ish. 41 symphonies, 25 piano concerti, 5 violin concerti, 22 operas. Each opera is about 3-4 hours long, right? They're like the musicals of the day. 23 string quartets. Oof. What a guy. Lots and lots of things. All brilliant, all wonderful. Go listen to some Mozart. Haydn. Plenty of musical compositions out there by Haydn. 104 symphonies, 68 string quartets, 16 overtures. Again, overtures, just like a symphony of just one movement. He's so famous, Haydn, so famous, that publishers would just lie and say he composed something even if he didn't, just to make it sell. So somebody could come to a publishing company and say, I have this string quartet. And they'll go, ooh, this is a nice string quartet. We'll publish this. What's your name? And Karl von Dittersdorf. And they go, well, no one knows who Karl von Dittersdorf is, so we'll just lie and say it's Joseph Haydn and then publish it. And because of that, because the publishing companies straight up lied, we don't really know how many pieces Franz Joseph Haydn composed, because a lot was attributed to him just to make it sell. So again, that's a huge, imitation is the highest form of flattery. So there you go, Haydn. Who else to listen to? Franz Schubert. If you play piano or if you're a singer, Schubert is the guy for you. He writes beautiful, beautiful songs. So if you picture like Elton John or Billy Joel or India Arie or Alicia Keys, that sort of music comes from classical time period. We have Schubert writing songs with piano accompaniment. We have Felix Mendelssohn. I mentioned him earlier. He's one of those child prodigies. As he grows up, he actually sort of rediscovers Bach's music and reintroduces some great Bach pieces to all of Europe. Of course, we have Beethoven. He starts his music in the classical time period, and then he single-handedly changes it to later. But again, that's a different story. We have Boccherini. We have Clementi. If you don't know Clementi, he's a piano composer, and a lot of great piano music is written during this time period because the piano is invented, and Clementi is one of the big names in piano music. In fact, Mozart and Clementi had a piano off, sort of a, I'll play something, you play something, and we see who wins. And it was a tie. And Mozart even said, all right, I guess so. You're pretty good at this thing. So Clementi, an important person. But don't forget, Wolfgang actually had a sister. And in fact, Wolfgang was the opening act as he traveled throughout Europe when he was young, like when he was 5 and 6, when that whole thing started. He was the opening act for his sister. His sister was the concert pianist, and his dad just took him on tour because, look, this 5-year-old can play violin too. And then he just was so precocious and such an audience attention grabber that Wolfgang became famous, but really he was in support of his sister, Maria Anna. So don't forget to listen to her if you can find her. And also Felix's sister, Fanny Mendelssohn. Fanny Mendelssohn was such a great pianist and composer that she actually inspired Felix. So don't lose out on these women composers because they had a lot to offer as well. And in fact, if we went all the way back to the medieval time period, 1000 to 1400, the first big composer was Hildegard von Bingen, a female composer. And then quickly people tried to steal credit for her work because she wasn't a monk, but there you go. Her name still lives on, just like Wolfgang's sister Maria. So Maria Anna Mozart and also Fanny Mendelssohn. Give them a listen. Wonderful composers, a lot to offer. Fortunately, underrepresented, but great stuff if you can find it. So all of this hopefully gives you a little bit of insight to why classical music as a whole genre is called classical music, because this era is what standardizes so much of music that we know today. The Beatles' music follows all these classical forms: sonata form, 8-measure melodies, the chord progressions, the harmonies, all of that stuff comes from the classical time period. So very, very important. So thank you for listening. Hopefully you can find elements of classical music in whatever you listen to at home, and happy listening.